In 1644, September, King Charles broke his siege of Plymouth and left the area. Behind him, he left Sir Richard Grenville and a small force of 800 men to keep an eye on Plymouth. He wasn't strong enough to really invest the town. But by Christmas of that year, he'd raised an army of 6,000 men, mostly locals and from Cornwall, Devonshire and Cornish royalists. He managed to pay their wages on time, feed them and clothe them and train them. It was an amazing force, broken up into 4 regiments, a cavalry force and artillery. When he felt strong enough, in January 1645, he planned an attack on Plymouth, the northern defences, from his bases in the old royalist earthworks there. On the night of January the 10th at 2 a.m, he launched his attacks and tried to capture 2 of the earthworks. He managed to get his troops into these earthworks but was pushed out. Licking his wounds, he planned a further attack but away from Plymouth. This time he chose to occupy the old Fort Stamford, the ruins of which are to the right over there, now occupied by the new Fort Stamford. The old Fort Stamford was an earthwork and had been demolished after it was captured by Digby's forces in 1643, a royalist attack under Prince Maurice. Now he planned to establish a force here and attack Mountbatten, the Mountbatten Peninsula. It was then called Howe Sturt, and it was much narrower then. At the far end of this peninsula, there was a force of several hundred sailors in occupation. We're travelling down the narrow isthmus of what is now called Mountbatten Peninsula. In this area, roughly from north to south, east, right to left if you like, was occupied by about 200 to 300 sailors from Captain William Batten's flotilla of ships that was constantly on duty around Plymouth. We didn't have enough soldiers to man all the defences, so the Navy lent some of the soldiers to the Plymouth garrison, and these were often in action in some of the forts and were at the Sabbath day fight, but mostly they were based here at Mountbatten. In fact, Mountbatten was actually named after Captain William Batten, the commander of the squadron that was based here in Plymouth at this time. We're now on the Mountbatten foreshore. To the right would have been Plymouth Fort, where the citadel now stands. You would have seen that from here in those days. Doesn't look too far away, and you would have seen the windmill further back. And to the left, you would have seen Catdown, and every now and then along that route, right around to Pomfret, Lara, you would find cannons, gun emplacements, protecting that part of Plymouth. Although the town was up here, and that area for about a mile was open, there were a few houses, but there were also guns there to stop an enemy landing on that part. This area would have been occupied by the sailors of Captain William Batten's flotilla. And on February the 6th, these men spotted a body of royalists up on the ruins of old Fort Stamford. Rather than leave them there, they launched an attack against them. They marched up the peninsula and threw the royalists out. They were only a small detachment looking at the old fort under Sir Richard Grenville's orders. These men were chased all the way back to what was called then Plymstock Work, which I believe is Burrow Hill, the top of Burrow Hill, the high ground. There, the pursuit stopped. Their royalist commander, Colonel Philip Champernowne, was wounded. He'd only just recently recovered from his wound during the Lanhydrock expedition, and now he was wounded again and put out of action. We're at Turnchapel, looking across at Catdown. Over there, you would have seen in the old days of the Civil War several batteries which could be fired over here at the royalists based at Fort Stamford during the Civil War. The royalists fled all the way down to Radford and came up this hill to a fort that was known to have been here, at least a lookout post called Plymstock Work. It makes sense that it was here. I'm not 100%, but I believe it was here. And it was here that Colonel Philip Champernowne, from the Champernowne family at Modbury, was wounded and taken into the fort. If you go up here, years after the war, the reason I think it was a fort, because years after the war, they found a cannon barrel from the period buried in the ground, and it was being used by cows to scratch. And that was there for many years. Since then, it's been removed and placed at the monument at the top here. Here we have the cannon barrel, buried in the ground for centuries. That's why the back piece is all gone, rotted away. This is what's left. And if you look, this does look like an area that would have been used for a fortification. You can see everywhere from here. You can see an attack coming from any direction up here on Burrow Hill. We're coming up to where Fort Stamford was located during the Civil War. As I said before, this new Fort Stamford is not the old Fort Stamford that was here. That was an earthwork named after Henry Grey, Earl of Stamford, in honour of his taking command of the Western forces. If they only knew what a useless commander he was during the war, they wouldn't have named it after him. To the right is St John's Church. This is the area that the Roundheads would have marched up during their attack in February 1645, which we'll be talking about soon. These allotments northeast of Fort Stamford were found to contain a number of cannonballs and musket balls from the Civil War. I spoke to the people who owned them years ago and worked in them, and they said, oh, we've always finding cannonballs and musket balls. This shows the intensity of some of the fighting in this area. There were so many that they dumped them. I can't believe it, but they dumped a lot of them. There was nothing left to see. On the night of 17th of February 1645, 300 Royalist musketeers marched up to Fort Stamford and reoccupied the ruins. They spent the night under their Lieutenant Colonel Mahoon rebuilding the old fortifications, and by morning they were 12 foot thick and between 4 and 5 feet high, but there were no artillery pieces in them yet. When Lord Robarts was told this news in Plymouth, he quickly organised a detachment of 400 Roundhead musketeers and sent them across the Catwater by boat from Cat Down. They were ferried across the water along with a small cavalry detachment under Captain Matthew Cousins. These men disembarked near Turn Chapel. The cavalry went ahead and beat off a Royalist mounted detachment that was sent to keep an eye on the area. The infantry lined up and marched up towards Fort Stamford, which is behind us. Up the high hill they marched. Mahoon's men lined the walls with their muskets, and when the Roundheads came up within range, they opened fire. They fired off a volley. And these volleys in those days, they created a bank of smoke. The Roundheads approached the fort and returned the volley. And before the smoke dissipated, the Roundheads had managed to reach the fort walls. Within a few minutes, they were scaling the walls. The musketeers in the fort, the defenders, fought well, but when their ammunition blew up, they lost heart. Despite Mahoon's trying to get them to rally and hold their positions, they started to break up. Many of them fled, the rest simply threw down their arms and surrendered, and the fight was over in less than 20 minutes. We're standing in front of the Hoo and Turnchapel Community Centre, which is behind us, below what would have been the old Fort Stamford. Looking in front, we see the Hoo Turnchapel area. This is where the boats would have landed and unloaded those 400 Roundhead soldiers for their attack up here. Down here, you can see the allotments much better, and you can understand why they would have found musket balls and cannonballs in that area. It was part of a siege line during the First Battle of Fort Stamford, and it's from the direction in which the Roundheads attacked in February 1645. I sometimes wonder where they buried the bodies. Over 110 prisoners were captured at Fort Stamford. The rest fled. The prisoners were secured and ferried back to Plymouth and marched through the streets, where a crowd had gathered to jeer at them and insult them and throw food at them. In the prisoners, 3 men were recognised as being former soldiers of the garrison: a Captain Maynard, Lieutenant Ashford and Lieutenant George Battishill. All 3 were court-martialed and sentenced to be hung on the 21st of February 1645. 2 days after their trial, on February 21st, the 3 officers, Maynard, Battishill and Ashford, were brought here to Mount Gould Road, close to the Lara Point work. They were brought here to be hung. And it's quite ironic that they probably looked across the Plym to where Fort Stamford once stood, the scene of their treachery. The hangings took place on the high ground behind us to the right. The gallows was set up there deliberately so the royalists, who were on the other side of the Lipson Creek, would see what happens to traitors. Sir Richard Grenville's army was north of Plymouth, and they would have seen the gallows go up and known that some of those captured at Fort Stamford were being executed. On the afternoon of February 21st, Maynard, Ashford and Battishill were hung over there on the high ground, as I said before. There was an eyewitness to this event, John Sims, the curate from Sheepstore Church, who had been a refugee in Plymouth for many months. Within the town itself, the day had been chosen as a thanksgiving for the victory at Fort Stamford. And Sims came up here not to celebrate, but to be a witness and keep a record of what happened. In his own words, he said, the 3 men were hanged and he observed that they showed no sign of remorse for their sins, nor any indication of repentance for their deeds. They died very sinfully, being abominated and hardened in their insolence. Now, of the 3 men that were hung, George Battishill was a Plymstock man. His wife, Grace, had a family, and they were abused throughout the rest of the war by local people who did not like what her husband did. And she was forced to leave and live in poverty until the Restoration, when in 1662 she petitioned the new king, Charles II, for a pension and was awarded £6, 14 shillings and 4pence for her husband's execution. What happened to the bodies of the 3 men? They were cut down from the gallows and buried close by, along with another man who was held prisoner for trying to turn over one of the outer forts to Sir Richard Grenville's men during their January the 10th attacks.
What does close by mean?
Near the gallows. They were took down There was a pit dug nearby, and all 4 men were buried, the 3 together. I always, in my research and in my book, I always like to find a human interest side to this history of the Civil War in Plymouth. And I've managed to scrape up a number of names of common soldiers, if you like, who fought and died and have been forgotten for almost 400 years. And I found their names. And these men were not killed on sight. They were brought back to Plymouth, some as prisoners, others as wounded parliamentarians, and were buried in St Andrew's Church. I'll give you their names. Robert Dannon, George Smale, Lewis Baker, Henry Gill, Richard Hamlin, and Captain William Hill. These were royalists, and they were all buried within 2 months of Fort Stamford. On the parliamentarian side, some of these men came from Plymouth. Jacob Burgess, Thomas Colburn, William Mason, Humphrey Barnes, Richard Shepherd, William Mountson, John Callis, Francis Maltbury, Walter Trout, ensign, and Richard Lewis. They were all buried within 3 days of the fighting at Fort Stamford. They've been forgotten.